Okay, time for part 3 of Unit 3, and now we are getting into brushes. And we've looked at brushes a little bit in the past, but as a reminder to you, unlike all of the other things that we've used so far, brushes do not make their own layers. So brushes are not vector items. We can't make them bigger and smaller because otherwise if we make them bigger, they will get pixely. Up to a certain point. Brushes are created at a certain size. But they are what we would consider bitmap or raster. They're like paint. Clearly, they're brushes. So you need to make a new layer when you're going to use a brush. So we're going to create a layer. It's a little new layer button, which looks right next to your trash can. Click it, and it will be layer 1, and you're going to need to rename that layer. Let's call it Brush Me, because we're going to brush this layer. Now, in Photoshop, we have the Brushes tool, and then you have a drop down up here to choose the type of brush. Now, in Photoshop, it's pretty cool because we can import lots of additional brushes, and these new brushes get their own little folders. So I have a bunch of brushes in here, Distressed Marker Brush and Spaz Splatter, which is one that we're going to be using. And then we have categories of all these other ones. And then there's general brushes, which are going to be round and sometimes square, different shapes that you can have. Notice some of these brushes are really, well, they're called hard brushes. They're not blurry. And then some are fuzzy. Those are called soft brushes. So if I click on this, see how this says hardness of 100? That solid edge on a brush is what we call a hard brush. That soft edge is a soft brush. That fuzzy edge is a soft brush. So if I wanted to blend things together with a clipping mask, I'd use a smart brush because, or a soft brush because it's fuzzy, and then it's going to be more gradual. Okay, so again, we've used these before, but we haven't looked at hardness and softness. So if I were to brush on here, let me use my bracket keys. Remember the brackets to the right of the letter P. So here is a hard brush, right? And then here is a soft brush. So you can see there's a great deal of difference between the two. So if I was using these as a clipping mask, let me just throw this girl up here. So if I took this girl and I clipping masked her in here, let me turn her on so you can see her. So the hard brush, the edges are strong like that, it's solid, and the soft brush, the edges are very fuzzy and wispy. Okay, so that's the difference, and you can draw any shape you want to create that sort of look. Okay, now I'm going to erase those, or actually I'll just delete this layer and make a new one. But you know, you can use an eraser. Erasers are brushes. So, okay. So there's the built-in brushes. Let me go to Photop just so you can see. We click on the brush tool here. Same story. There's a drop down, and then there's some built-in brushes here. Not near as many as Photoshop, and not in categories. Just like the shapes. We didn't have categories for our shapes in here either. But if you look, if I pick one of these, I still have a hardness slider. So I can choose whether my brush is hard or soft. So that's an option that you always have regardless of program. Now, to add additional brushes, just like in Photoshop, we can click that little arrow again, just like with adding the shapes, and we can load brushes. So brush files are called ABR. I really don't know what the A stands for. I guess the BR stands for brush. A brush. I don't know. Load a brush. So we're going to load a brush, an ABR file. And the one that I have in your folder is called Spaz Splatter. So I'm going to hit open. And then now if you go to your list, at the bottom will be your new brushes. So number 1 looks like this. And number 2 looks like this. So they're just kind of splattery brushes. Number 11 looks like this. Okay. So let me go back to Photoshop. In Photoshop, to load the brushes, it's a similar situation, but you can't do it from the exact same spot. So it's called import brushes. So instead of the down arrow, we use the gear. Instead of load, it's import. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. But otherwise, same story. You go in, let me import this one called One Cracks. And then it just adds it to the bottom. But see, in Photoshop, it adds it into its own little folder. So I have One Cracks, and then you can see the brushes a little bit better. Now, the one we're using is Spaz Splatter. So I'm going to go in here. We are going to use number 11. So let's go ahead and click on number 11, and we'll have it ready to go. Now, go ahead and we are going to use that girl. So let's go ahead and move her up and turn her on. So she's right below the Brush Me layer for now. And then make sure you're clicked on the Brush Me layer. And let's just go ahead and start brushing. So if I just click one time, it's kind of like stamping. You know what I mean? Like you can stamp it. Or if I click and drag, it's like I'm brushing with that splatter. Like that, right? Now, notice that these are all kind of the same. Like if I just keep going down the side, the edges are going to look identical. So one thing that you can do is you can modify the direction of your brush. Now we're going to have to bring up another panel to do that. So I'm going to go to the window menu because that's where we go to get panels. And we're going to go to the brush settings menu. And then in here, there is a thing called angle. In Photopea, it's also called angle, but in Photoshop, we have this compass we can use to change the angle instead of having to actually type in the box. So notice here, now I've turned it around, so that big circle is on the edge. See, I have like the big circle there. So if I don't want the whole thing to look identical, I can rotate my brush a little bit and then stamp these edges, and then rotate it again and stamp a different edge, and I'm going to get a different look out of my brush so that the edges are not identical to the previous ones that I've put down. Okay. And then of course you can modify the size, same thing. It's that bracket keys to the left of, or to the right of the letter P. So I'm going to make it small and then just kind of blob all of this. Or you could switch to a regular brush at this point to fill in all these gaps. But what we want is don't go past this line at all. Okay, don't get super close to it. But we want to have kind of this kind of thing going on here. Okay, and go back through and rotate your brushes a bit so that they're not identical all the way through. Okay, oops, didn't mean to do that. Okay. All right, so something like that. If you do too much, you can always go to your eraser and erase a little bit, but you might want to switch your eraser to be a kind of funky little brush, or just erase a bunch of it and then fix it. So it's probably a good time to pause because this part may be a little bit time consuming. I'm going to pause and go over and do this in Photopea as well and show you the brush settings panel, which is just called brushes in Photopea when I come back. Okay, we're back. Hopefully you've got that all handled now. I've also done this on my Photopea one, so we've got that in there. The color doesn't really matter for this as long as you don't go past that line, because if you go past the line, then you're going to see that color in the area that goes past the line. All right, so all we have left to do is to put our girl on top, and we're going to clip her into that brush area. So I'm going to right click in the space and go to clipping mask if I'm in this program. And if you're in Photoshop, you're going to right click after you get her on top here and create clipping mask. And so we have that basically going on in both of these now. Now let's look at the brush panel in here. If I click brew, that brings up the brush panel. You'll see it's similar to the other one, but you have to actually manually push angle this way. But not really that different. Basically, the concept is the same here between the two. And again, you can go to Window, Brush to bring it up, or you can hit the little button for brushes here. And really the same thing in Photoshop. There's a brushes button over here that you can hit for your brushes and your brush settings. So, all right, that's basically it. At this point, we just need to turn on the picture that goes behind her picture. So we've got this Olympics picture. It's basically like, you know, she's dreaming, she's working hard so she can eventually be this gal someday. So we'll turn on the Olympics picture down here at the bottom. And then let me go back over in here to Photopea and we'll do the same thing. Olympics is down here. We're just going to turn that on. And there we go. And I didn't make my circles as big on this one, but it's okay. So there you are. Now you can still, and you wouldn't necessarily want to, but you can still transform. So you could take your move tool and transform the clipping mask. So I could take that shape and pull it in, and then it changes what you see, right? Because it's a clipping mask. So if I go too far, see that blue starts to show. So I have to make sure I don't go out past the edges of where that blue is. But you can still modify your clipping mask, and I could still click back on here, or I could even unclip it and turn this off, and I could paint on here, and I could change that, or I could erase and redraw parts of that, or I could use a different brush. if I wanted to. Matter of fact, let me just show you what happens if I take a soft brush. So instead of using a fancy splatter brush, let's just say I use a really soft brush here. Okay, so actually let me erase first. I'm going to take my eraser and I'm just going to erase right here. Okay, and then I'm going to take a soft brush. Okay, you make it pretty big. I like to use really big soft brushes. All right, there we go. So there's that. And now, if I turn her back on, she might be over a little too far. I may have to fix this and scoot it over. But I can right click, make a clipping mask, and now it's going to ever so slightly blend, which like I said, my thing goes over too far, so I need to pull it. Oops, wrong picture. Need to pull it back. Got auto select on, so I can't grab a hold of stuff. There we go. So you have to really watch that edge. Whenever it's a soft brush, the edge like really tends to go. But you can see there what happens. So that's kind of neat, right? You can use a soft brush to just let your pictures blend straight into each other like that. So it's up to you. I wanted you to at least see how to load a brush so that you could see this kind of effect. But feel free to experiment with other brushes. And feel free to try that soft brush just so you can see what it looks like. Or you know what? Add another picture. Download another picture. Throw a little picture in the corner that has like a little fuzzy thing going on around the edges of it. Use that as a clipping mask so that you just have one that maybe fades in there. So play with that. Do what you'd like to. And then save it. And let's come back for the final part where we'll get into paths and typing on paths.